Krynhanda, everyone. I'm very excited to be here virtually, at least with you in Pen Llŷn. Sort of to start, to kind of give a little context, I fell in love with Wales when I was 12. I was visiting with my family. It was actually in the Pen Llŷn area. And I just found it beyond magical as a 12-year-old. And one afternoon we had been to Porthor for the day. And I very solemnly turned to my mother and with all of the sort of gravitas a 12-year-old could muster said, when I die, I want you to thrust my body into an orange crate and hurl me off the cliffs of Porthor, because that's, I think, how I want to go. And she's very long suffering. And she said, oh, okay, we can do that. And a bunch of years later, I grew up in Pennsylvania in the United States, and I was working at a diner while I was going to college at Penn State University. And there was a group of guys that came in, and I heard this accent, and I thought, I think that's a Welsh accent. So with the same kind of awkward enthusiasm, I went rushing over to this group of gentlemen and said to one of them, "Are you Welsh? And if you are, will you teach me how to speak Welsh?" And this was David. And so I met him many years ago, and he did try very hard to teach me Welsh, and I did not retain a whole lot of it. My brain did not wrap around it, but I got to know Wales through a slightly different set of lenses at that point, and got a sense of the creativity and the life force and the rebellion and the whimsy and the sense of imagination that sort of David articulated as somebody coming from Wales. So I have spent a bunch of years thinking about place and thinking about story. I have a doctorate in mythology and psychology. And what that really, the framing for that is really about looking at what the big stories are that are sitting in the backgrounds of our culture. One of the best descriptions I've heard from a colleague about what a cultural mythologist does is that we try to do for communities and regions what psychologists do for individuals. So really kind of going deep into what a sense of place is. And I live now in the Catskill Mountains of New York, in about 2 hours from New York City. And my husband and I own a retreat center, and we work there with an idea about imagination. And what we try to do there is help people imagine past what they think is possible. And so that, I think, was what caught David's attention, and thought maybe I could come and play with some ideas with you today as you are thinking in Pen Llŷn about what you guys want to do about climate change and how you can reimagine how that's working. And I was really struck. I talked with David and Phil and Grant and Greg a little bit on Thursday, and was very intrigued by the fact that in some ways we're 3,000 miles away from you. In some ways our worlds are very different. And in some ways the Catskills, I think, are very much like Northwest Cymru, that we have similar the kinds of things that we're trying to protect, that we're trying to save. We have a lot of small communities. It's an area that is not dominated by a big city, at least close by. And so my hope is that as we sort of think about being neighbors across the ocean and kind of woven together in this distance way, that I can help you guys play with some ideas a little bit. And the part of this is in response to when you met last time working Otto Schwarmer's the theory of the U, and thinking about the bottom of that U and the idea of presencing, as he talks about it. He describes it as connecting to the source of inspiration and will, going to the place of silence and allowing the inner knowing to emerge, which is, I think, in some ways really a good definition of what sort of stepping into imagination is. And I know that certainly, as I think about climate change, it's really huge. It's so overwhelming. It feels so really catastrophic and terrifying, I think. And I think we've had kind of two major narratives emerge about it. One is that it's so big and it's coming, and we can try to sort of, like David hurling stones at Goliath, try to stop this huge wave of awfulness that's happening, despair that's coming, and that we can try these sort of small band-aids and we can see if we can help it, but really we can't change it. And so there's a very, I think, strong sense of kind of hopelessness and Armageddon that's coming. And then I think the other narrative has been sort of the la 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 la, it's not real, it's not happening. And I think those are two really problematic narratives. And so part of what I have been trying to do is I've been working with people in my community, thinking about how we can adapt and change and think about climate change, is thinking about a third way. And I think that's about imagination. I think it's about imagining past it's possible. And I think one of the things in that makes sense is we often talk about the war against climate change, what we're battling with climate change. And I think I understand where that comes from because it feels very urgent. But I also think that in some ways it's really not a great image. And so I'm wondering what happens if we change that image to, instead of the kind of protectiveness and fear and anger and aggressiveness that comes out of war and those images, what happens if we say we're going to reimagine and go out and wide and deep and reimagine how we're kind of living with each other, living on the planet. And I think if we can do that, then we actually can find ways to thrive, not just as humans, but as humans in this larger landscape. And I think that's a great idea, right? It's lovely. Oh, yes, we'll imagine past what we think is possible. It's a great phrase. But what does it actually mean? How do you actually do that? So my hope is in the next few minutes, I can throw out some things that will spark ideas and energy in you as you continue to work with each other and generate ideas. And one of the things that I wrote my dissertation on frivolity, because I was getting this ridiculous degree in mythology, but I loved the idea of what frivolity can open. I was looking at it as a way into imagination. I was using an idea from Immanuel Kant about the purposefulness of purposelessness, and how if we get away from being outcome driven and being worried about sort of the answer or the resolution to something, what opens up for us? And what happens if we allow ourselves not to feel like we need to be big and huge and portentous and really, powerful, but instead allow ourselves to think about scale, about having little ideas or playing a little bit, being a little bit light. And so part of what I want to do today is invite you to be a little bit frivolous with me as we play with these ideas. And I know that when you're thinking about something like global climate change, there's a resistance. You go, but this is really serious stuff. So part of what I want to do is play with paradox a little bit and say, yeah, and sometimes to go small is to go big, to go local is to go global, to go light is to go heavy. Like we can, when we think allow ourselves to think in ways that don't feel overly important in the moment, those can become really important, extraordinary things. So there's a lot of paradox here. And again, I think what that happens is when we do that is that I think we can just give ourselves space to think about ways that we might engage with the world that we haven't thought of before, that aren't practical, that aren't rule bound, that aren't following kind of the dicta that people talk about that are experts in these fields, because they know all the rules. And I think one of the great gifts of being people who love a place, who care about a place, who may or may not have 30 years in engineering or geological sciences or any of the kind of related fields that are the pros are helping us with. I think that the gift of being an amateur, which in Greek means a lover of things, is that we can open things up in kind of a different way, and we can do it in a really local way. And I think that's part of the key as well. I think that we can reimagine our local worlds and then together build, really, we were talking on Thursday with when I was talking with Grant and David and Phil and Krug about sort of this tapestry, this weaving of all of these local connections with ideas, rather than thinking about the big global solutions that have been the way we've tended to do this, because I think that's one of the challenges and one that we need to look past. That if you look at, for example, the oil industry, having a global oil industry has brought us to some really hard places. So part of it, I think, is sort of allowing yourself to be small. So that's sort of one place and one set of ideas about how we might change things. The second one that I think is really interesting, again, holds a sense of paradox, is how imagination works in our head. And I think one of the things that I love about images that I love about this is the Greeks, when they talked about Namasani, who is the goddess of memory. So she's the goddess of looking back. She was also the goddess of imagination. Excuse me. So they intuited this sense of looking back and looking forward, that you need to go back to move forward. We need to go down to go up. That, again, that paradox. And I think in a place like Pen Llŷn, like in a country like Cymru, it's a place of incredibly deep memories that are mythic memories. And in some ways, this is one of the ways I think that the Catskills, where I live, is similar to where you live. There very powerful sort of energies in these mountains, and senses of stories that sit in these mountains. The land feels itself like it holds memories, I think. And I know it's a place that you have fought for and continue to fight for, and are protecting, and are holding a sense of identity and essence there. And so I think one of the things that can be really valuable as you're imagining the future is to think about the past, and think about what the memories are that you're holding, and what your community's holding, what your stories are holding, and even what the land is holding, and the sea around you, and the air around you. And this isn't necessarily literal. It isn't necessarily, well, the tribes that were here in Pen Llŷn 2,000 years ago did something exactly this way, and that's the way we should do it. If that's a kind of reductive thing, I don't think that's helpful. But I think that looking at sort of what the essence is of where you are, what is it that you love, what is it comes up about this place that feels really important and really alive, and what its purpose is. I did a number of years ago some work with a friend and colleague of mine who's very deep into the regenerative movement, where we were at the land at Spillian, which is the name of my retreat center. And we were talking about what the essence of that place was. And we had started by talking about, well, what were we trying to do there? And what was the kind of image, the vision of what we were working towards? And what was the building doing there? We have a not old by Welsh standards. We have an 1880s estate that was built actually by the Fleischmans of Fleischmann's yeast. If you guys bake, you probably know Fleischmann's yeast. But beyond that, sort of more deeply, what is the purpose of this land? We are just below the beginning of the Delaware River watershed. And so we're not right at the top where the water's coming from, but we're very close. And one of the things as we thought about it, that this particular piece of land was trying to do was to slow that water down, and to continue it moving down into the Delaware River, but slow enough that it could exchange nutrients, that it wasn't just kind of scouring the landscape. And it was moving through this land in a very particular way because of that. And that became an image that was really opening for us as we thought about what we were doing there, and realized that in some ways that was exactly what we were trying to help people do, was to slow down and exchange nutrients with each other, exchange ideas with each other. And so one of my questions to you as you guys are thinking about this is, what is Pen Llŷn trying to do? What is the peninsula trying to do? What is the landscape around you? And how is that reflected in what your communities are looking and feeling like now, and also what you might imagine forward? What is it there again? What is it you want to protect? What is it that you want to imagine into fullness? And again, I think if we do that, we start to break into away from, or break through the sense of, well, the only thing we can do is X, right? Well, we can only do, we're a small community. We don't have this resource or that resource, so we have to be very reactive, but instead start to kind of call upon this place and who you are in your deepest sense, and what this place is in its deepest sense, and how that can inform maybe wild, crazy ideas that maybe nobody else has thought about, that are relevant exactly to you and to Pen Llŷn. And I think that being back to local is a really important part of it, that it may or may not get imagined the same way elsewhere, but it's something that I think each one of us in each of these places, as we imagine things that are relevant to who we are and what we're doing, that starts to build that tapestry that we were talking about on Thursday. And so just one last thought, because I know I'm running a little bit long here, is I think the third way to do this, to think about it in an imaginal way, is to sort of break the binaries that we get caught by. And so I've got just a few that I'm going to toss at you just to sort of cook in your brains a little bit. I think one of the big things that we think about, particularly when we're thinking about energy and technology in one way or another, is that things have to have costs. If we're going to have one thing work, we have to sacrifice something else. I don't think that's necessarily true. And I think that that's something that maybe you can break with. I think another one is the sort of growth idea that comes out of Western culture and capitalism, that we always must be growing, we must be consuming, we must be getting bigger and bigger to thrive. I don't necessarily think that's true as well. I think another one is that language and culture and art aren't practical and aren't necessarily connected to this sort of scientific effort to survive. And I think, Wales is one of the places that has proven that's not true over and over and over again. And I think, just even when I met Davids, he was really immersed in the early 1980s, the battle that was happening with broadcast licenses and broadcasting in Welsh, as a way to make sure that the essence of being Welsh didn't disappear. So I think you guys hold that, I think in many ways a lot more than many Americans do, because you're connected. Another idea that I think is really important is that what's beautiful matters. We've talked ourselves into believing that things being utilitarian are more important than actually being beautiful. And I want to challenge that. And I think that things that are true solutions to things actually have a kind of beauty in them and respect the beauty that's there. So basically, I think my invitation to you is to think about imagination as a way of seeing. That it's kind of a turn left when it feels like you're supposed to be marching in a front line. I think there's a bit of rebelliousness to it. The creativity is rebellious. And so thinking about where those barriers are in a very literal way, one of the things that I actually often do is, if I'm feeling stuck, I will literally just turn and look in a different direction, because my vision of what I'm surrounded by changes. And it can be really interesting. If you sit in that presencing idea of Schwarmer's that you were working before, that silence, that intuitive knowing opens up something really different. It just even looking through a different window, you're going to see the world differently. I'm going to end with a quote from Einstein, because I love the fact, as one of the greatest physicists to ever live, one of the greatest scientists ever live, he loved imagination as an idea. And one of the things he said about it was, I am enough of the artist to draw freely upon my imagination. Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world. And so I think, as you guys are working together on this, to hold that in yourself in this local way, and in what you're doing, and whatever the scale is of what you're doing, that sort of infinity, hugeness, vastness of what imagination can bring is really clear and powerful and open. So hopefully this will spark some stuff, and diolch yn fawr.